Okay, so we're standing in the virtual reality component of the Huberman Lab here at Stanford University School of Medicine. And next to me is Melise Yilmaz, who's a PhD in neuroscience from Harvard, who's now a postdoctoral researcher in the Huberman Lab. And this box, this room that Kyle and we are standing in was built specifically for the kinds of experiments we're going to talk about today, which are to understand really what the physiology underlying the stress response is, to really understand how breathing, heart rate changes in the visual system, how those come about. And the goal of this project is really straightforward. Whether that we're not trying to scare people. What we're trying to do is we're trying to understand what's going on inside the body and in the brain as people experience different things. And their subjective reports of, yes, that's scary, or no, that's not, are very interesting to us, but we're really trying to figure out how their subjective reports and their physiology match, because a lot of the people that come through here have regular levels of anxiety, and then we also look at people who have so-called generalized anxiety that suffer from an inability to regulate their internal state. And so today, Kyle's going to go through a couple of the different what we call stimuli, which are virtual experiences, which is the best way that we can bring real life experiences to the lab. And we're also going to explore some of the so-called interventions, things like hypnosis and breathwork and so on, as a means to try and allow people to modulate their internal state better than they did before they show up here. We're not a clinical lab, this is a research lab, but it has very real clinical implications. And we hope to move some of this to clinical trials in the next couple of years. Melise has a very specific interest in addition to that, which is to really create some objective measures of mental health. So maybe you want to just talk about that for a moment or two.
Sure. Yeah, so I think what makes this project unique is that we're able to measure real behavior. So people actually move and we actually look around, as opposed to, filling out a survey or a test or watching an unrealistic image. And so we, using those real measurements of physiology and behavior, the goal of my research is to create objective biomarkers of anxiety. So we recruit people with anxiety and also healthy individuals, and then we use statistical techniques and other techniques to see what is it that is different in these two groups in their behavior and physiology. And also now we're adding neural responses. You're combining neural responses with the virtual reality experiences.
So when Melise says neural responses, we've got a collection of patients at UCSF as well as at Stanford, and through collaborations with neurosurgery, we're able to do the equivalent types of experiments that you're going to see today that Kyle's doing, but in individuals that have electrodes lowered down below their skull. So they've had a neurosurgery, there's a piece of their skull's been removed, you've got electrodes down there chronically. So the electrodes are in there all the time to measure things like seizures, but it's allowed us, I should really say it's allowed Melise, because she's the one who's been doing these experiments, to do what we believe are the first recordings from the human brain in VR while people are in VR. So she's recorded from the human amygdala, the so-called fear center of the human brain, as well as the frontal cortex, the insula, all these areas that you hear about and there's a lot of discussion about. And the reason for doing those electrode recordings is that when you use EEG, no knock on EEG, it has its utility, but that's just the first centimeter of the outside of the brain. And a lot of the stuff related to the sorts of things that go on in anxiety are happening really deep. So it's like trying to understand the currents of the ocean by just looking at the white caps on the waves. EEG is kind of at that level, and then deep electrode recordings are much more invasive. So Melise has been taking essentially the equivalent of this laboratory up to UCSF, often several times a week, to work on these patients, and we're really excited about where those data are going. We can talk more about it later. For now, I think we should talk about today's research subject. Definitely one of the larger and more fit subjects we've had in our lab, although we've had some athletes here before. So Kyle is standing inside the virtual reality chamber, if you will. This is an exact duplicate made for humans of some of the work that Melise had been doing in mice during her PhD at Harvard. So giving mice these stimuli to scare them, to see whether or not they run or they hide or they fight, when she came to the lab, she said to me, I want to work on these topics, but I want to do it in humans. And so here we are. This is, as far as we know, the first laboratory of this sort. The walls are padded just because occasionally people walk into them, although I don't think that'll happen today. Kyle's been in small enclosed spaces with a lot of action before, so we're not too concerned about his safety. So she'll give him instructions, and we're going to take him through some of the experiences that both healthy and people with anxiety experience when they come to the lab. I should mention the VR that we put together is unique in that some of it is done with computer generated images, but this is, as far as we know, one of the earliest phases where we've been taking one of the first examples where we've taken real world images, 360 video, and then stitched those together. Melissa stitched those together with programmers to create real world environments, because it's very different than looking at cartoon images. So the VR experiences that we're going to use today, we'll talk about as we go along. But that took about a year and a half of going out and diving with great white sharks, of sending tree climbers up in trees and doing all that. I can provide you some of those images if you like of the real world, and trying to bring that back to the lab. Because as Melise pointed out, having someone fill out a questionnaire or look at pictures of skulls, that's just not very realistic, And so now, 2019 heading to 2020, we're able to do things that are far more realistic in the lab.
So the red line is respiration. So there's a pressure sensor on his chest. So as he's inhaling, the pressure increases, so it goes up. As it's exhaling, it goes down. This is the skin conductance response. So it is a measure of autonomic arousal that is widely used. And then this is his electrocardiogram in green, and you can see the heartbeats there. This is just our digital indicator to tell us when the movie's on. And so,
yeah. And then we're also measuring eye movement and pupil size.
Right. That's being recorded as well. It's just not shown on the screen.
So this is some drone footage of the boat that we took out to Guadalupe Island, Mexico, for twice, actually, 2016, 2017. There are a ton of great white sharks in the water there. And so Michael Muller and his collaborators taught us how to do this and collected the 360 video for us. We got permission from
the skin response going up.
Yeah, there you go. So as soon as a novel stimulus, in this case a shark, shows up, his skin response goes up. That doesn't mean he's afraid. In fact, he's almost certainly not. What it means is just that, it's amazing when you really think about it, that the level of the skin, the moment that you see something, there's actually a change in conductance at the skin. Mm-hmm. There's a reason for that, which is, which some of your listeners might know, but some of them probably don't know, which is that acetylcholine and norepinephrine are released in the so-called sympathetic response. This is like, people talk about fight or flight, but I think if there's any takeaway from this, it really, like in that one event, that bump, what it shows is that you don't have to be afraid for your sympathetic nervous system to start generating activity at the level of your skin, your breathing, and your heart rate. It's happening all the time, right? So your level, your sort of tone, your autonomic tone, as they call it, is always being modulated. And so we're interested in what those modulations are, how quickly they happen, how things like heart rate and sweating combine with things like subjective reports, like, no, I'm not scared, that's just interesting. That's, being interested in a novel stimulus or the appearance of something to us is just as intriguing as so-called fear. And I think it's just been hard to do these kinds of measurements previously because there was no way of bringing these kind of subtle variations to the laboratory. But that's what you can do with VR. So this is a view of what he sees, but in his world, of course, everywhere he looks, it's 360. So he's got sharks above him and below him. That's our friend Michael Muller, who wears a yellow wetsuit to look like a tuna to bring the sharks in closer. He's leaving the cage, so that's actually illegal. But we had permits from the Mexican government to do that. People do it out there anyway, but it carries a hefty fine, not the least of which is that you can get eaten. But the idea here was to be able to get really close to the animals without the cage barrier. Not something I recommend unless you know what you're doing. And I did this on the second trip. It turns out that swimming toward the animals when they come toward you is a way to disrupt their prey-predator response. But anyway, that's another discussion. This is interesting. So those modulations in breathing, heart rate, and skin conductance are something that we really want to understand, because one of the major goals of neuroscience is to be able to predict things like anxiety attacks. Nobody knows how to predict depressive or anxiety attacks. We know when people are already anxious or having a panic attack or depressed. Anyway, Kyle's looking very relaxed here. He's obviously not somebody, at least from my cursory read here, that has generalized anxiety, but gives you a flavor for the kinds of experiments. Now, the pupil size is an interesting one, because when you have so-called autonomic arousal, the pupil of the eye gets big fast, and the eye is actually part of the brain. It's a piece of the brain that sits outside the skull, and that dilation of the pupil is accompanied by a physical change in the shape of the lens of the eye, and that's actually so that you can track individual things in your environment better, and the background falls away. And so when you're even just mildly stressed or interested in something, even just curious about something or somebody, you literally, your view of the world is completely altered. And that's why, if you see a text message and it's kind of disturbing, you might bump into somebody, you might miss your exit on the freeway. You literally can't see it. It's tunnel vision. You're seeing the world through a soda straw view. And so you become visually fixated. A lot of people don't realize this, that your visual world is completely shifted the moment that you take interest in something, because of this effect of acetylcholine and norepinephrine on the actual eye muscles, the muscles of the iris of the eye, as well as other structural features of the eye, like the lens. And I'm whispering because we don't want to disrupt his experience in there. Yeah, every fall these sharks gather off Guadalupe Island, Mexico. The way it was discovered is kind of interesting. There were some tuna fishermen out there hanging tuna off their belts, and a lot of guys were getting eaten. And so somebody realized, wow, there are a lot of great whites there. And the moment you park there, they just circle up around the boat. And for the 2-3 days that you're there, it's just nonstop. It's for research purposes. So that's Michael Muller, Mornay Hardenberg, and Brock Maxey are the guys that really kind of pioneered the VR experience of this. And let's see, they'll swim right at you, right? And that's the kind of thing you just can't get in a cage. This is interesting. I think he gets awfully close. So let's see all this activity. So that's just, Kyle's probably not even aware that those changes are happening. This is not the kind of thing where in fact, his heart rate is very, very steady. So you can not even be aware that these physiological changes are happening. But what's striking to us is that at the level of the periphery, like at the level of the skin, far away from the brain, right? You've got these events that are almost as fast as the things that are happening in the real world to trigger them. It's amazing if you think about it. The body and the brain are just in this collaboration all the time, and reading these signals. And one of the things we're very interested in is figuring out like what patterns of signals predict different kinds of emotional response. Right. And again, the shark stimulus is not designed to be scary or even terrifying unless you have a fear of sharks. It's really designed to kind of bring you into the virtual environment. So we've got Kyle Kingsbury in the lab today in an experiment that we do with so-called healthy people and people with generalized anxiety. And so he's down in the hallway right now in hypnosis. So on the last podcast, we talked about so-called interventions or tools that people can use to modulate their internal state, whether or not that's because they are high anxious or whether or not that's because they're high performing and they want to perform even better, or whether or not they understand the value and power of sleep, but they're having trouble sleeping. And so, my lab's involved in a number of things, but one of the things that we really want to do is create new protocols, new tools that people can use to improve their ability to get into sleep, to calm their internal state, or to ramp up their internal state if that's where they perform best. Because Kyle and I were just talking about his experience of one of his best win fights where, his anxiety heading into the cage was very high. And the moment he got there, in the moment of a task, everything got quiet and calm, and he ended with a terrific win for himself. So that's a really good example of the fact that in some cases, and for some people, the higher states of arousal, so-called autonomic arousal, might actually be more powerful in terms of performance. So the three so-called, we call them interventions, but really the three tools that we've been looking at, these are just physiological tools to change internal state, to perform better, or to relax more, are hypnosis, and this is a form of medical hypnosis. I'll explain what that is. Respiration physiology, breath work, as well as something that most people would consider as sort of like a meditative script that combines some breath work as well. So first of all, hypnosis. So Kyle's down the hall right now. He's in hypnosis. He's listening to a script that has his thoughts and the context of his thinking directed in a particular way. And I talked a little bit about this on the last podcast, but if you missed it, I'll just kind of summarize real quick. Hypnosis involves narrowing the context of your focus so that you are not self-conscious about some of the things that you might do or say. This is manipulated in stage hypnosis, but we're not doing that right now. This is a form of self-hypnosis where he's hearing a script that allows him to direct his thinking toward the notion of internal control over his breathing, control over his heart rate, control over his mental state. Now, there aren't a ton of data out there on hypnosis, but there's some that are starting. David Spiegel, who's in the Department of Psychiatry here at Stanford, has used hypnosis for things like smoking cessation, anxiety. So this script is very much like the sort that David uses. And one thing that people could consider would be the use of a hypnosis script to direct their thinking and their behavior in the way they want to go. Now, what am I really saying? What I'm saying is that, many of your listeners, many of you, the listeners, exercise. You believe in cardiovascular exercise, strength training exercise, mobility exercise, flexibility exercise. We don't have a lot of formal clarity on what exercises are good for the brain. But hypnosis, there are pretty impressive data, even though it's a limited number of studies, that it can improve one's ability to control their internal state. I mentioned some of the scripts from Michael Seeley that are available free on YouTube. Again, no business or other relationship to Michael Seeley, never met him, but those are the ones that I happen to use. We have some that we're working on in our lab, and then we're evaluating what content in the hypnosis is really key. So right now, Kyle's using an experimental hypnosis paradigm, just a new hypnosis script, where we're measuring things like how important is the cadence of the voice, the level of the voice that you hear, the duration of the hypnosis. I personally use a hypnotic script, one of the Seeley scripts that lasts about 10 to 30 minutes. He's using a 20-minute script right now. What we're trying to do is find those kind of minimal duration, minimal parameters, so maximum effective dose for changing your neurology simply through listening, through hearing something in a script. So this is in woo. There's no notions of mindfulness or kind of mysticism in this. This is purely using the sensory input, auditory input, sometimes visual as well, to modulate one's own internal state after you get out of the hypnosis. Okay, so hypnosis is one. If you come to my lab and you're a subject in an experiment, we can also provide you the hypnosis script. When you leave, we do hope once we do plan, I should say, once the data are published, then we can distribute this as widely. One of the things that's really great about hypnosis and these other kinds of interventions is they're essentially free. That they're not costly. The second so-called intervention is respiration work or breath work. Now here, at risk of sparking a lot of controversy, I don't think we yet know at all what the best patterns of respiration are for performance and for eliminating anxiety. One thing that is becoming clear, however, is that long duration exhales, blowing off a lot of CO2, can be a powerful way to rapidly downregulate the stress response. So when people say, you get stressed, take a deep breath, that's actually the opposite advice. You should say, take a long exhale, give a long exhale. The breathing quickens when you're stressed, and taking in more oxygen is probably going to bump up your arousal state. So if there's any kind of simple thing that I think we can all trust, although now I'm, just by saying that, I'm sure I'll invite some fire, but that's okay, bring it. I'm tougher than I look, so, especially when it comes to ideas in neuroscience, we can debate this. I would enjoy a healthy debate about this, but a long exhale can be very powerful for rapid downregulation. Okay, there's a lot of debate now about nasal versus mouth breathing. I'm gonna probably upset a few people by saying this, but I don't think we know yet which one is better under which conditions. I think we really need to do the experiments Now, there are real world experiments too that people in the performance community are doing. I think that's terrific and I applaud those. I'm not saying we need to do all the experiments in the confines of the university. However, my lab is looking at how long duration exhales impact the anxiety state, not just when you're doing the breath work, but afterward when you're engaged in, say, a virtual environment, a real world environment, and that stress hits and you want to down regulate, okay? So we're testing the hypothesis that long duration exhales are what are important. In my lab, we're not paying particular attention right now to nose versus mouth, but we have some other experiments in which we soon will. Again, once the data are published, and that should be within the next year, maybe sooner, we intend to reveal how different patterns of breath work, nose, mouth, long duration exhale, proportionally more inhaling impact even the amygdala, the fear centers in the brain, as well as cognition, the ability to do cognitive tasks, kind of like some of the simple ones that Kyle was doing today. Simple not because he couldn't do more sophisticated tasks, but because we sort of limited what we can do in the laboratory for all people. So we just kind of go to common tasks, very simple spatial tasks, but it is powerful for allowing us to tap into cognitive states. So what patterns of breathing are most useful? That's a key question. So a takeaway would be, one, check out Hypnosis on YouTube. Very interesting. They, as well as some of the scripts that are going to start being released from the medical community, they can be powerful for a number of people. Breath work or long duration exhales seem to downregulate people's level of autonomic arousal pretty quickly. Again, nose, mouth, interesting debate. There's some, I saw an interesting video of the late Charles Poliquin, where he talked about something that I'd love to test in the laboratory. We don't have data on this yet, but he talked about how closing the left nasal passage and breathing through the right nasal passage would increase levels of alertness and autonomic arousal, whereas doing the opposite, closing the right nasal passage and breathing through the left nasal passage would decrease autonomic arousal. I tried it, so just subjectively in my own experience, this isn't in my lab, I would say that there might very well be something to it. I kind of did experience a kind of lift from the breathing through my right nostril and a down, kind of more calming through the left nostril, but I may have been biased because that's the way he said it would go. But I do think it's a powerful and interesting one because there's been so much in the yogic communities about closing one nostril and hemispheric breathing and this kind of thing. So interesting. And then the last one is this kind of meditative script that we use for people with generalized anxiety that looks a lot like the so-called yoga nidra, N-I-D-R-A, or sometimes spelled N-I-D-R-E, that I talked about in the last podcast that you can find on YouTube. Just a note about that. So in my lab, we're not looking at yoga nidra. What we do is we have someone come in, they go through these experiences of the sort you saw today, and then we give them this deep relaxation protocol where they're hearing a voice which tells them to relax their muscles, to relax their gaze if their eyes are open, maybe to close their eyes, and to focus their attention at the surface of the body, further away from the body to sounds in the room, then back into the body. So they're learning how to move their attention out of their own physiological experience to outside external stimuli. That alone can be very powerful. Learning how to deliberately shift your attention and not have your attention yanked around for you while doing different patterns of breathing. So things like long exhale breathing are characteristic of Nidra. Now, some of this I realize is a repeat of what was in the last podcast. I wanted to just kind of put those three tools out there because it was a long one. And if you take nothing else away from this, would be that, hypnosis may have some utility and power for you. The different types of hypnosis can be very tailored. So it's not just, relaxation or increased level of alertness. They've got ones for smoking cessation, for combating procrastination. There are a lot of things. Whether or not they work or not for you, you'll have to just be your own scientist there. But in terms of essentially zero cost, except for the time involved, protocols and things to try, they seem, essentially safe. Although obviously, talk to your doctor. I'm not a physician. I always say, I'm not a medical doctor. I don't prescribe anything. I'm a professor, so I profess lots of things. But your medical care is your business, not mine. The other thing, in terms of thinking about respiration, is right now there's a ton out there on hyperventilation protocols where you're breathing in a lot, cycling your breathing a lot, and getting into these kind of amped up states. I think those actually could be quite powerful for certain kind of levels of mental and physical performance. But right now, there's no science that I'm aware of. And so that's one thing that we're very interested in. I'm working with various groups here and off campus to try and understand what the best protocols would be for high performance in hyper aroused or hyper oxygenated states. So that's where we're headed. Hopefully those takeaways will be useful to you. I personally have benefited a lot from doing a long exhale breathing protocol once a day for about 5 minutes. There's actually a different way to go about getting these long exhale breaths through the day that I just wanted to propose, and this is just something I do in my own life. We haven't brought it to the lab yet, and it's something I just call it clock breathing, which is every time I look at the time, whether or not it's on my phone or watch or a wall clock, if it's 1 o'clock or anywhere between 1 and 2 o'clock a.m. or p.m., I'm rarely up at 1 a.m., but I do one deliberate conscious long exhale breath. If it's between 2 and 3, I do 2. If it's between 3 and 4, and so on. And so throughout the day, because I tend to look at the clock a lot, there's times when I'm actually stopping and doing 12 full breaths. And this is a way of distributing, it averages out, if you do the math, to more than 100 conscious long exhale breaths throughout the day. And this may seem kind of hokey, but it's one way of doing breath work without having to sit in a chair and say, okay, I'm going to do breath work for 5 minutes or 10 minutes, which seems incredibly simple and like anybody should be able to do it. But a lot of people, in our experience, in the lab setting, in the clinical setting, and just out in the community, the general public, people don't follow through with these things very consistently. And so it's kind of nice, actually, if you look at the clock, I'm sometimes like, oh, nice, I only have to do 3 breaths, which is kind of, I should want to do more, but, I'm human. So I'll do 3, I'll just pause and do 3. Doesn't matter where I am. Long exhale breaths. Typically, I'll do them pure nasal, but that's because that's what works for me. But you can do that at any point. Now, if you don't look at the clock between 4 and 5, does it matter? No. You can look at between 5 and 6 and do the breath work. Again, this isn't to say that this is the most powerful form of breath work at all. It's just to say that your breath work doesn't have to be done in one sitting. It can be spread throughout your activities. And then, I happen to run a very long, very busy schedule from morning until night. And so this is a way in which I can introduce respiration physiology, conscious respiration physiology throughout the day, which is really what I want, because I want to be able to think well, perform well in all domains of my life as I'm moving through the day. And so I'm constantly in touch with that aspect of my nervous system through this, what I'm calling clock breathing, which is not a trademarked or commercialized thing at all. It's just it's the simplest way that I could describe it. So a good example of clock breathing would be, okay, I think right now it's somewhere between 12 and 1 o'clock. So I'm not going to do 12 breaths on camera, but because it would take up too much of your time. But what I would do then is, if I look at the clock and it's 12:38, I would pause and do 12 inhales, and then proportionally longer duration exhales. So an inhale and a long exhale would be 1, and I would do that 12 times, so it would be between 12 and 1 o'clock. If I didn't look at the clock between 12 and 1 o'clock, I would not do it at all, but then between 1 and 2, I would just do 1. Now, is there some sort of important math to this? No, it's a way of using a natural gauge, a natural calibration point, which is the time of day, as a way to have me doing conscious breath work throughout the day. And that could be while I'm running, it could be while I'm training in the gym, it could be while I'm teaching. It doesn't matter, right? The important thing is that you are doing some sort of work to train your nervous system to downregulate, or at least to stay in a plane that you control through respiration physiology, through breath work. And it doesn't require, I don't believe that breath work has to be done by sitting, certainly not by lying down or closing the eyes or doing anything sort of symbolic or ceremonial, although it can if that's what you like to do, but it can just be spread throughout the day. And this is actually something that we're encouraging people to do, and we're going to be exploring it as an experiment for people who are, say, in graduate school, in medical school, running high demand athletic lives, athletes at various levels, students, and then just anybody really, because doing a breathwork practice takes kind of an allotted amount of time. And even though 10 minutes doesn't seem like much, it's the whole process of setting aside time and moving into that space, which seems to act as a natural barrier for people. So we're really just trying to lower the barriers for accessing these conscious breathing protocols. And so that's the way I would go about it.
And I think it's interesting that, for 20, 30 plus years, people have been taking a supplement or drinking a cup of coffee and then going to a workout to get a better workout, and then consuming things afterwards to recover better. But in a lot of ways, we still think about things like meditation and hypnosis as separate from anything you might ingest. But and I guess this is sparked in part by the whole psychedelic movement. Like, what should your mental state be when you're doing things to modulate your physical state, and what should your physical state be when you're doing things to modulate your mental state. So like one thing that I think would be really interesting, my lab's not doing this yet, but I would love in the future to explore would be, for instance, like how some of the GABA analogs might improve people's ability to relax and go into deeper meditative states or more efficient hypnosis states. I think that's going to be a really exciting next generation area. Students, I don't necessarily condone this, but people do various things in order to study better, right down to some pretty dangerous practices, which obviously I don't condone. But I think that it's kind of interesting to think about how supplementation and behavioral practices might eventually be combined.
Yeah, you got me thinking about this ketamine nasal spray that my doctor has me on.
You're doing that now?
Yeah, and ketamine's been completely legal, and obviously there's different treatment centers, and the range is wide. Intravenous or intramuscular injections, a whole different animal, and I have experience with that. But the nasal spray is, there's levels to it, as with anything else, and you can scale it. But I'm able to meditate so deeply on just the spray, and I've done float tanks combined with it, and I've been just gone in the float. And then,
so you feel like you get more out of those
just so
practices.
much deeper. Yeah. So it'd be really cool to take a deeper look at that and actually see, like, is it just a feeling that I have, or is it actually changing the neurochemistry and altering things in a way where I am dropping in significantly deeper?
Yeah, because we have this idea that you have to do things every day. Like you got to meditate every day, or you got to do your breath work every day. A couple minutes ago, I was talking about, I just spread my breath work throughout the day. I just do it by using the clock as a way to tell me how many breaths I should take. It's just a simple way of doing breath work without having to set aside some time specifically for that at one moment. I think that it'd be really interesting. I'm curious though, what's the subjective experience of ketamine like? I've never tried it, and I'm wondering, like, do you feel calm? What is it?
Yeah, like in the lighter doses, there's definitely a euphoria. You feel good. At higher doses, my buddy jokingly calls it forgetamine, because you might be mid-sentence telling a story and just be total blank, But and then at heavier doses, whether you're snorting powder like Street K or snorting the ketamine spray that's prescription, you can get to a psychedelic space. The injections are purely psychedelic. I've had, from a visionary standpoint, I've relived like pretty significant memories, good ones too. Like the first time I did ketamine in college at ASU, it was off the dryer in my washer and dryer room with all my buddies waiting to see what was going to happen.
Just to be clear, I, Andrew Huberman, am not condoning doing any illegal or street
it's
drugs.
all on the up and up now,
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, it is out there as a therapeutic tool. I mean, I think we really are in the midst of an incredible tide change where, universities are studying these kinds of things. Clinically, they're tools. We were just talking about how context is really important. And, I guess kind of just going back to this idea that how to get the most out of a meditation session, how to get the most out of respiration physiology, how to get the most out of hypnosis. There's the idea, do it 6 days a week and with a day off on the weekend, kind of like the old school weight training protocols were. And then now people realize, hey, you can actually do, shorter duration, high intensity. I think all of the same kind of parameters or variables that people have explored in the physical training space can work as a kind of a template for exploring the mental augmentation space. And certainly, supplementation and various substances are being used in combination with performance. We know that that's a big thing, and they work. And are appropriate in some contexts and not in others. And it's going to be really interesting to see what science can provide. I guess one thing that, I posted this video on Instagram the other day of an MRI. It was actually done here, of the brainstem kind of like morphing as somebody breathes.
Yeah.
And it got, I don't have a super high volume Instagram site, but we have enough people coming our way, but it was, a huge peak in terms of the number of people that, saw it and commented and made the rounds. And it was like intrigued, like people love the idea that the brain is changing in real time in response to something like respiration physiology. And it's thrilling. I'll never forget the first time I saw it. I was like, wow. And so I guess then I got a couple comments that were interesting. I take the comments seriously sometimes because they are a window into the general public that normally I don't have here. We're on a university campus now. We're in School of Medicine. I don't get a lot of access to the outside world, so to speak, unless I, read those. And so, and someone said, we don't need science to tell us what, yoga, and it's known for a long time. And I agree. But the role of science, I should be really specific, that the reason for doing scientific experiments is that if we understand mechanism, like really how nasal versus mouth breathing or right nostril versus left nostril breathing is impacting the brain and body, then we can create new protocols that neither scientists nor physicians nor yogis nor anyone has ever thought about. Once you understand what the pieces are, what the kind of macronutrients are, then you can start creating new protocols. And so I feel like the discussions, I feel very grateful that you've brought me on twice now, because I really feel like they're people like yourself who are offering a bridge to the real world for science to do better, not just for the real world to be like, oh, science, great, but for science to do better and provide people more of what they really need. So
I couldn't agree more, and thank you. And I'll have you back again and again. You're doing great work here.
Thank you.
But there, a comment like that, I was chuckling to myself thinking of that, because it's like, obviously they're down with yoga and some of these practices that have changed their lives. And the thought process is, we don't need you to tell us that it works, because we know it fucking works, right? I could have the same thought process around psilocybin mushrooms or ayahuasca, but a smarter person will understand there's an entire population of people that only, like, they are in the science of religion, or the religion of science, right? And they're completely tied to that, and where that goes, like even the knock against some Western medicine is that it takes 30 years to implement something that's just recently come out in science. Like, it's just the fact that there's a slow change,
it's
right?
Admittedly slow.
So why not take a look at these things and understand it better, and then say, hey, like, turns out tryptamines don't fry your brain, and they actually can help increase neuroplasticity and many other things. I think it's very cool that we're starting to see that now at different universities, and people, really smart people, some of the best people in the world, are taking a look at it. I think it's going to help a lot of people.
Yeah, it's interesting because the collaborations that are happening between scientists, but also science and the actual world, the real world. Because as you saw today, right, even with the state-of-the-art VR, right, the best VR that we can possibly come up with, real footage of, video footage, not computer-generated images, physiological measures. We even put people, where, like I said before, we're recording deep in the brain. Even with that, it's not real life in the same way, right? And so to get tools that are really valuable for real life, we have to pour all that at it. And we need the discussion to go both ways. I have a saying that, my PhD advisor always said, that I try and keep in mind, because I'm a human too, which is that tolerance has to go both ways, right? Scientists need to be more open to the general public, and the general public needs to understand that not all physicians and scientists are really like tied in deep with the pharmaceutical industry, and not all of the pharmaceutical industry is evil and bad. At the point where something becomes really clear that it's valuable, it's got to scale. As you know, you run a supplement company in addition to doing other things, or which is you got to bottle and sell things to get them out there. Otherwise, it stays niche, it stays pocketed. So I think the more conversations, the more like skeptical conversations are good. The more like arguing is good. I'm in a field where 90% of the time scientists are telling other scientists they're wrong. So I got a pretty thick skin. People tell me like, you're an idiot, you don't know anything. I'm like, that's great. It just means I got to work harder and push, and push back when I need to. So I think we need the conversation to go both ways, and it's super exciting. Again, like on the last podcast, I'll say I'm not going to take any particular stance on what people should do or not do in terms of their healthcare. That's up to them. But I do think it's extremely exciting to see the kind of things that people are doing with diet and exercise, thinking about longevity, thinking about mental state. I don't think it's just in the more sort of, affluent or progressive areas, if you will. I think the whole world now is saying, look, we need to take control of this organ in our head, like this thing housed inside of our skulls. It can either make us miserable, make us feel amazing, or across the course of a day, both. We got to do something about it. So anyway, I think that there's tremendous power in supplements. As I mentioned last time, I'm a huge fan of the idea of taking, for myself, again, reasonably researched and thought out tools to augment mental state makes all the sense in the world to me. And drinking 10 cups of coffee does not make sense to me. Some of the better nootropics that are out there are really interesting, and we need more controlled studies.
Yeah, couldn't agree more. Dude, it's been so fun coming here to the lab and getting to explore some of this stuff. Thank you so much for having us.
Thank you for coming out here today and taking the trouble to let us wire you in, you're definitely one of the people in this community that I was referring to. That I really, the hand that you're extending out of the community you're in to the community that I'm in, I'm certain is going to lead to really important places. Thanks
awesome,
so much.
brother. We'll do it again.
Fantastic. Thank you.